Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas to you all out there. God bless you and your families. A little side note here before we get started. I know a lot of people are very interested in what is going on in Israel. And if you'd really like to know what is going on in Israel without the jibber-jabber of the politically controlled press, go to thegoldenreport.com and get familiar with that website. It's excellent, excellent information. And tonight, boy oh boy, we do have a zinger. And we're going to be talking about the DaVinci Code. And I just really can't think of anyone who has their research better organized than Olaf Hage. Go to Olaf's website, thetimequest.com. Get familiar with it. Blah, blah, I can't talk. It's cold here. It's snowing out here in the desert tonight, and it's kind of neat. Anyway, we welcome you, Olaf, and how are you?
I am fine, thank you.
Good.
We got rid of our snow. We've got nice 50-degree temperatures and rain up here.
Well, dadgummit, you sent it down here.
Maine is snow-free, more or less, and you guys, everybody else has snow. Now you know what we have to go through.
You know something? I've got to tell people this. This is powerful. You know, God is really wonderful. I lost my driver's license about a week and a half ago at the bank. I lost it. Today, I went into Walmart, and there was my driver's license. Somebody had taken it from the bank and turned it in at Walmart, of all places. I couldn't believe it. That was just bizarre.
Wow, that's neat. Now,
yeah.
Did you have some way to identify yourself, such as your driver's license?
It was funny. No, the girl looked at the picture, and she looked at me and said, "That's you." So anyway, you're going to be talking about the DaVinci Code.
Yes, the DaVinci Code, the Dan Brown novel, which actually is part 2 of at least 3 or 4 parts. Part 1 was Angels and Demons, which was published in the year 2000.
People think this DaVinci Code book is real, that it, you know, and it's fiction.
Oh, that's right. It's novels.
Yeah.
Although, you have to be careful, because Dan Brown claims that while the characters are fictional, even though based upon real people, that the rest of the material is, in fact, true. And, of course, that's not true. But we'll have to explain what we mean by all of that.
Yes.
As I said, Volume 1 was a book called Angels and Demons, which he had, which was published in the year 2000, and then the DaVinci Code, which came out a couple of years ago now, I guess.
Right.
And the movie for that will be coming out in the summer of 2005, and then he has another 3rd novel in the series, which we don't know the title of, but it will take place in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason for that, as I'll get to in just a second.
Okay.
And that one will bring in the Masons. Now, it should bring in the Masons, because if you look at the DaVinci Code, on the inside front cover, I believe it is, there's a coded message which is actually a Masonic slogan. Something about the widow's son. I forgot the exact wording of it. So he is very much interested in the Masons. Now, he has admitted that early on in his life, he had contact with some people from the National Security Agency.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, I used to go to a Bible study at the home of somebody who worked at the National Security Agency, but, you know, they don't tell you what they do there. For all you know, they're the janitor. So, you know, who probably has to pass a security clearance too, you know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what he means by dropping the hint that he had, you know, contacts with people at the National Security Agency, except that his first novel, I believe, was what took place at the National, or a lot of it anyway, took place at the National Security Agency. that novel was, actually I can tell you the name of it here. I got all kinds of resources in front of me, so I should be able to answer these little questions very quickly. But he wrote, I think, 5 novels so far. And the first one was called Digital Fortress, published in 1998, and that was set at the National Security Agency. And the second one, Angels and Demons, 2000. And then the third one was called Deception Point. Now, this is an interesting one. Deception Point was a thriller involving the White House, NASA, and possible life on other planets. So you can see that he's following a kind of popular paranoia subject matter. He writes about the NSA, he writes about life on other planets, and he writes about the Priory of Zion and the whole business about Jesus and Mary Magdalene possibly having children, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
He's hitting all kinds of things, all of which have one thing in common, and that is that he starts writing at 4 a.m. in the morning. Well, he does. He writes for 4 hours from 4 to 8 in the morning. And the problem with that, of course, is that 4 o'clock in the morning, if he is still living in the East, which I guess he is, would be about the time that Coast to Coast AM starts taking phone calls. Mm-hmm. And the main subject matter of the show is primarily over, and from that time forward, it's people calling in asking about the strange light they saw in the sky that night. So his books are about the subject matter that normally you hear about on late night radio.
Right.
He started writing them in, I guess, 96 or so. And there are 5 of them out now. Of course, the latest, there's 4 out now. The 5th one is the Washington, D.C. sequel to DaVinci Code, which is coming. Mm-hmm. Now, what Angels and Demons, the DaVinci Code, and this upcoming book have in common are that they have a character named Robert Langdon, who is a Harvard symbologist, as if Harvard would let anybody have that kind of title. But he's the guy who goes looking into ancient symbols and their significance and their meaning and the historical background of everything, you know. And there's a woman, I think her name is Victoria Vetra or something, and she's sort of the femme fatale of the books. She goes along and helps him solve these mysteries. So it's sort of a mystery novel type approach, but on the other hand, it's part thriller, part historical novel, that sort of thing. And it purports to have a lot of accurate information sprinkled in there. He says that his whole purpose is to teach, and he has been a teacher. He taught English anyway, English literature. And he thinks that what he's trying to do here is to educate the reader. Of course, it would have helped had he devoted some time to actually learning about this material himself.
That's always helpful.
Before attempting to teach others things that he didn't know anything about.
Yes.
So the problem is, so far as I can tell, he doesn't really have any background in anything except maybe art history. And while art history is interesting, the Da Vinci Code, of course, includes some material about the Last Supper and Da Vinci's paintings. That doesn't really begin to touch the subject matter of his books. In particular, this business about Jesus and Mary Magdalene being married, producing a child, and that leading to a line of royal figures on down to our present time, or people who could be king if the right things happened. And it also really doesn't begin to talk about all of the issues regarding the Bible, which he gets into, about where he claims, for example, that there are 80 other Gospels besides the ones that we know about. They were all censored out of the Bible, and we weren't allowed to read those other Gospels and so forth.
Oh, goodness. You know, Olaf, there's a popular, and we won't mention names, late-night talk show. And for years, people get on that talk show, and they talk about all these books that have been taken out of the Bible. And I don't think that that's exactly true.
Well,
Yeah.
No, absolutely not true. No, there's not a word of truth to it. The fact is that we have Bible manuscript material from the first century, and obviously a lot from the second century, even more from the third, and more from the fourth and fifth and so forth. So we can see what was in the Bible and what wasn't in the Bible, and from that we have quotations of the Bible from the early church fathers prior to the Council of Nicaea, I might add. A lot of actual manuscript material from prior to the Council of Nicaea. We have codes, not codes, what do you call them, canons.
Yes.
I've got Bible code in my head here. I got, there were canon lists drawn up by various early church fathers. We have those to look at. But you know, the most convincing evidence of all, and they all agree that the books we have now are essentially what we started with, and certainly there's nothing missing, nothing censored. Certainly none of these so-called other Gospels, which, by the way, there are not 80. Scholars recognize 30 Gospel fragments other than the New Testament Gospels. Those 30 are sometimes found in other books. For example, the so-called Gospel of Philip. Oh, my goodness. I've been visited by a little insect here.
Oh, no.
You got to go somewhere else. Go away. Yeah, he's not a little insect. He's one of these. Yeah, you get a walk on the phone. Okay, just don't press any buttons. Yeah, it says there are 80 other Gospels, whereas scholars find 30 Gospels, of which the Gospel of Philip is an example. Okay. Well, the Gospel of Philip is actually an essay by a Gnostic teacher several centuries after the Apostles, and this guy quotes from some other text which we don't know the name of, but they're calling his whole essay the Gospel of Philip. But in the process of quoting from this other text, he says this. He says that Jesus was accustomed to kissing Mary Magdalene frequently or often on the, and the disciples or the apostles were jealous of the attention that he was paying to her.
Nagamati. That's in Gospel of Thomas.
Nagamati text. And the translations vary, but you'll notice I didn't tell you what he was kissing her on. And that's because, in fact, that part of the text is missing. We don't know what he was kissing her on. In fact, in the Greek, this phrase could mean he was kissing her on Thursday, or he was kissing her on the side of the road, or he was kissing her in the house, or he was kissing her on the cheek, or he was kissing her hair. Because the Greek sometimes puts a definite article and sometimes doesn't, and it's often very difficult to understand why there is or isn't the definite article there. So the translators, in telling us that he was kissing her on the lips, have simply jumped to a conclusion. And then those who've read this text, including, I don't know if Dan Brown's actually read it because he uses a lot of secondary sources, but they jump to the conclusion that the text is saying that Jesus was having sex with Mary Magdalene, that they were married and had kids.
Well, that's, we have a very oversexed society, and that people couldn't possibly think otherwise.
Well, think about this for a moment. Why then were the apostles jealous that Jesus wasn't treating them the same way?
Yeah.
Did the apostles expect Jesus to have sex with them?
Well, there are certain accounts, people that would like to have other people believe
that's not ancient.
That the apostles were homosexuals, and they weren't.
There's not a single ancient statement to that effect at all. That's all in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Yeah, I know.
Ever said. Nobody even in recent times said that till since World War II. So really all in the last 50 years or so. And so you got to understand, since Morton Smith came along with his secret gospel and all of the slimy stuff that he inferred from that, which, by the way, doesn't say that Jesus or anybody else was homosexual, by the way, but that was what he read into it because that's what he wanted to read into it.
He's got a dirty mind.
Exactly. I mean, this is a case where the ugliness was in the eye of the beholder. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at the Gospel of Philip, it never says anything about Jesus and Mary Magdalene having sex or being married or anything of the kind.
Right.
It certainly says nothing about anybody having children by Mary Magdalene, Jesus or anybody else for that matter. There's just one little passage in there, and it's not really a gospel. It's an essay. They only call it a gospel because it's got a fragment in there, the one I'm just referring to, that may be from a gospel, though we don't know where it came from since nobody else ever quoted it. And so we don't really know where this guy got it from. But it was centuries after the apostles, so this is not some sort of ancient source. The thing is, however, that for you to believe that this has anything to do with sex, you have to believe that the apostles are jealous and angry because Jesus isn't marrying them.
Yeah.
And because Jesus isn't having children by them and not having sex with them and so forth. I mean, that's insane.
Well, it's obvious that there's a very rabid, like a rabid dog, effort to destroy Christianity, to destroy any moral underpinnings that people have. It's all everywhere, Olaf.
Well, and you're getting to the crux of what the DaVinci Code mystery thing here is all about, where all of this really comes from. To try to unveil this secret here, if this big insect will. He is large. I mean, he's giant. He's a big guy. But anyway, the thing is that once we understand what it is that motivates Dan Brown, and once we see where he's coming from, and we see where his sources are coming from, then we begin to realize that this is a much more sinister thing than it appears. This isn't just somebody trying to write a mystery novel.
Right.
This is a guy who himself has sympathies with kind of a neo-pagan cult that he and his wife and a few other people belong to.
And they're trying to justify it, see?
They're trying to propaganda. He's really spreading his religious views with this novel. And he goes around pretending as though, I just stumbled across some interesting information. I want to share it with people. That's really not very honest, because the fact of the matter is that this is material that comes from a very militant, anti-Christian, really anti-Semitic origin. And I think people need to know what the origins of all of this are, because when you start to look at it, and certainly Dan Brown, if he did anything like the kind of research he claims he did, should know that what he is doing here is foisting a hoax on the American people and everybody else who reads this. I don't know how many. Well, he's moving around. Hold on a second here, because I do need to convince him not to do that. Well, the trouble is, it's right next to my computer, and do you know that insects in your computer are the primary cause of computer crashes?
Oh my goodness.
That's right. Insects in your computer, and this one will not be causing a computer crash now. Thank you. Sorry. We have executed one of Dan Brown's allies who is trying to sabotage this show.
Oh dear.
Yeah, the problem is that anytime we look into this story and look back to the origins of it, we find some of the most slimy, disgusting characters and situations. This is not a pretty picture. It really goes back to, and not that this is even the beginning of it, but it goes back to a bunch of people who founded the Nazi Party in Germany. And they were very much into the fountain of the New Age movement, which was Helena Blavatsky. They included people like, of course, Hitler himself, and Rudolf Glauer, and Rosenberg, and all the rest of them. I mean, that group of people that Hitler started with in the very early days came out of a group known as the Thule Society. That's Thule. Some people might want to pronounce it Fool. But the Thule Society was founded to study the works and the ideas of Helena Blavatsky. And she spread some very anti-Semitic ideas, as well as anti-Christian ideas, back in the 19th century. And she only lived to be about 50 years old or so. But
she used to carry a gun around her neck.
Excuse me?
She used to carry a gun around her neck.
Oh, was that where she carried it?
Yeah, she didn't want any man to ever touch her, she said.
Apparently she was a virgin, although at least as far as men were concerned.
Yeah, good point.
Dealt with some strange people. Franz Hartmann, one of the people she traveled with most of the time, or much of the time, was a pedophile. He was the guy who was a pretty crude fellow. In fact, a number of pedophiles and homosexuals hung around the Theosophical Society in not only her days, but in the subsequent period when it was run by Annie Besant.
Mm-hmm.
And C.W. Ledbetter was in fact arrested for pedophilia in England, which is quite an achievement.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, these are the kinds of people that were involved in that movement, and the kinds of ideas, really, that they were promoting were based upon the notion that Christianity, the Bible, Judaism, they put a crimp in the ability of people to engage in all kinds of unpleasant sexual behavior. And as a consequence, they hated the Bible and Christianity and Judaism. And out of that grew the Nazi Party. Because,
well, you know, Olaf, anyone who is driven carnally would hate the Bible. That's true.
Yeah, the Bible really runs contrary to a lot of very sick activity out there. Pedophilia is really near the top of that list.
Yeah.
And so these people were involved in that. And of course, you know, in Hitler's high command, he had a number of people who were sexually bizarre. Even before he came into power, his brown shirts were run by homosexuals. I mean, this was a group of people who really hated the Bible, hated Christianity and Judaism, and they hated Judaism in particular because it gave birth to Christianity and the Bible. And so the Jews were the most hated group of all in the eyes of the Nazis. They wanted to get rid of Christianity, but they really blamed the Jews most of all. And as a result, Hitler and his friends were looking for a way to solve what they call this problem. And the final solution to the problem, of course, as you know, was the attempt to just plain kill them, round them up and murder millions of people just because they were Jewish. But they didn't stop there, because Hitler indicated that he also wanted to get rid of Christianity, and he couldn't, of course, kill all the Christians, but he decided, because there's just too many of them now, but he decided that he could persecute Christianity sufficiently that at least it wouldn't be practiced in any areas that he had control of. Of course, he ultimately seemed to want to control everything. So,
we know of people like that today.
Oh yeah. Now you got to understand something. When the Nazis were in power, Hitler had a problem, and that was, of course, he had to get elected first. He had to get into office first, and to do that, his power base was in Munich in Bavaria, which was the Catholic part of Germany.
Yeah, they didn't have electronic voting machines then.
Had to win the support of the Catholics.
Yeah.
He had been raised a Catholic, even though I don't think he'd been a Catholic since 1909. But so for about 20 years or so, he had really left the church, and he'd gone off in other directions, mostly neo-pagan, Teutonic, Gnostic mythology type directions. You know, he's going into the field of basically creating his own religion, although Ludendorff had already done that for him. But it's not clear that Hitler really had worked out his own religious formula in any great degree. But he certainly was anti-Christian, and we know this because the Hitler youth were trained. Children were trained to hate Christianity, and of course Hitler said he hated Christianity in the Mein Kampf, not just Judaism. So there's no question what his position was. But for political purposes, in the early days, he did, in fact, try to pass himself off as a Catholic. And he also, later on, even after people who read Mein Kampf began to realize the guy hated Christianity, he still would use the word God. And, of course, nobody knew exactly what he was referring to unless they read Mein Kampf and they began to understand the guy's mindset. But it was clear that he was referring in a pagan sense to God, and not to the God of the Bible, but to some other kind of God. The secrets of that are probably buried with Himmler, but he was certainly going off in some bizarre directions. Now, there were people in other parts of Europe, in France, for example, who were very sympathetic to what Hitler was doing, including in England. And among those were the royal families. Hitler made a deal to restore some of the royal families that had lost power at the end of World War I. He was going to restore these families to their royal thrones again. And that included the Tsar of Russia. It included, presumably, the Kaiser in Germany, although he had plenty of opportunity to do that and never did it. And other people in other parts of Europe that I would assume eventually the French were going to get another king. Well, there were people in France who lusted after the French throne, and among those was a guy named Pierre Plantard. And he was a young man growing up in France at the time. And in the 1950s, he and other anti-Semitic sympathizers with the cause, lamenting, I suppose, the fact that Hitler didn't win and give them the throne of France, decided that they would try a different tack to gain the throne, or at least to lay their claim in the hopes that someday perhaps their son or grandson or whatever would sit on the throne of France. And so Pierre Plantard joined up with a couple of other people, and he created an organization which had not existed before, based upon the name of a nearby mountain in the town that he lived in, and he called this the Priory of Zion. That's right. It didn't come into existence till the 1950s. He did this, by the way, after getting out of prison where he was sent for fraud. And he started to fake documents. And he fabricated a whole bunch of texts, historical texts, to try to prove that he was, in fact, the heir to the Merovingian French throne. And, of course, also to promote his anti-Semitic ideas. And as a part of all of this, he decided to, along with some of the fellow forgers, to place some of these documents in the French National Library.
Hold it right there, Olaf. We'll take a very brief break. This is Georgianne Hughes with our very special guest, Olaf Hage, and we'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and we're talking about fraudsters. And Olaf,
well,
what was going on back then? I mean,
they were trying to fabricate history.
Yeah.
And Dan Brown's helping. The DaVinci Code is really carrying on this effort to really rewrite history. Mm-hmm. And of course, you know, the Nazis were trying to rewrite history.
Oh, sure.
And a lot of people, and Helena Blavatsky, back in the 19th century, with ISIS Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine and so forth, she was trying to rewrite history and fabricated some of it. This whole business of faking history and changing it has been a major industry for about 150 years now. And since Blavatsky first started it in 1875, although I think you could go back a little earlier to the Mormons and a few others who were in the business. But the idea that people can fabricate history and just create just totally bogus history. We're not talking about myths and legends here, but people claiming that they're giving you the real history and know that they're actually lying and faking it and fabricating it. That's the kind of thing I'm referring to. And Plantard was doing that in the post-war era with great abandon. He had, as I say, a couple of helpers. They confessed, by the way, their role in the 1970s.
Oh, my.
And this became a big scandal, and the BBC, actually, in England, had done some documentaries on the idea originally with Henry Lincoln as a host. I've seen some of those documentaries. But after this was broadcast, people started to dig into Pierre Plantard and those people and discovered that, in fact, there was a hoax here. And so the whole thing unraveled in the late 1970s. And yet Henry Lincoln, even though it had been exposed as a hoax, and knowing that it was a hoax, went ahead and joined with Michael Bajad, another guy who's got some interesting connections, and Richard Lee, and these three then set about to write the book, which was first published as The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, and then in the United States was published as Holy Blood, Holy Grail.
They banned that book for a period of time in this country, I believe.
They should have. I mean, the book is a libel against Christianity and indirectly against Judaism. It's a horribly vicious pack of lies purporting to be history, and I'm not surprised that was done. There are certain things that other countries won't allow. We just embrace these things with abandon.
Yeah.
But there were countries where they looked at this and they said, "This isn't true. You can't say these." Away with it. And even though it was exposed as a hoax before the book was published, and well before, years before, they still went ahead with it. And it was a deliberate fraud, because Lincoln knew, and he must have certainly revealed this to his co-authors, unless they were terribly naive people. Michael Bajad, I've seen him interviewed. He seems to be bright enough. I can't imagine that he was ignorant of what was going on.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if anybody bothered to interview Plantard and any of the other principal sources here, they would have discovered that that a hoax had been committed. But these eager researchers never bothered apparently to do any research. So, as a consequence, the Holy Blood, Holy Grail series began, and followed by the Messianic Legacy, the Temple and the Lodge, all kinds of other books that have been published by this crew or parts thereof. So we've had a series of books published by them, and then a lot of other people have come along and cribbed from their books and created new books. And I have a whole shelf full devoted to all of these books. I mean, there's a lot of this material, and it's become a multi-million-dollar industry in its own right, and all based upon a total hoax. I mean, that's why I wanted to get into the Gospel of Philip nonsense, because you can see that of the 30 Gospels, not 80, but 30 other Gospels, that here's an example of one which was basically just an essay and had one brief reference to something that may or may not have been part of another Gospel, or this guy may have dreamed it, or somebody channeled it, or who knows what the source was, because he doesn't tell us. And there are missing parts of it. And it's only because a modern translator slipped in the word lips and spun it to make it sound as if it was a sexual encounter that we got into this whole idea that maybe Jesus and Mary Magdalene were having some sort of romantic encounter, and that this led to marriage and led to children and the whole Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing.
Yeah, well, I know the Mormons really push that idea.
Yeah, but it's all it's a house of cards. I mean, when you go back and you look at the sources, they don't say that. And when you start to uncover all of this, it just falls apart. There's nothing to it. In fact, ABC with Elizabeth Vargas hosted a documentary on ABC network television, which they ran at least twice that I saw, where they did just this. They took Dan Brown's assertions, they interviewed Henry Lincoln, they interviewed other experts, they went back and they tried to verify any of this, including with people who were very pro-Gnostic gospel, Elaine Pagels, Aaron King, and people like that, and they couldn't find any support at all for the claims that Dan Brown and Henry Lincoln were making. And so, and they said so. And they said there is nothing at all that we could find to support the idea that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had sex, that they were married, that they had children, or any of these things. So, and again, ABC is capable of blunders, especially in the news department.
Oh, yeah.
But they happen to have gotten this one right. And so there simply wasn't any basis for this. But Dan Brown's followers don't realize that. They don't realize where this came from. Well, in 1993, there was a court case in France, and Pierre Plantard was put on the witness stand. And it was on another matter, but he was being interviewed, of course, by the lawyers and asked various questions. And in the process of this, it came out, and he admitted under oath that he had hoaxed this material. So now there's no defender left among the original group that had created all of this stuff in the first place.
Oh, gee.
All now have confessed that it was a hoax. And it's completely on the record, under oath. There's no question about it. It's a hoax. There was nothing to it. There was no prior in Zion, and of course, prior to the 1950s anyway. Leonardo da Vinci obviously couldn't have belonged to it, or anybody else that's mentioned in Holy Blood, Holy Grail, other than, of course, Pierre Plantard, who created the whole thing in the first place. So it's a non-existent thing. It's a fabrication. And many of these other statements, as I say, that Dan Brown puts into the novels are not true either. And there are many books now that have come out, and I have here in front of me a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. U.S. News and World Report has a collector's edition thing called Secrets of the Da Vinci Code, the Unauthorized Guide to the Best-Selling Novel. And that's $8. It's on your newsstand, and it's sort of magazine-sized discussion. It's got about 15, 20 articles in it on various aspects of this. Lots of nice pictures of Da Vinci's artwork and things like that. And it's certainly a nice full-color publication. If you're really interested in this stuff, it's worth getting. And in here, they expose Pierre Plantard, that whole thing, as a hoax, and his Nazi leanings, his anti-Semitism, and so forth. And again, here's another book, Cracking Da Vinci's Code. You've read the fiction, now read the facts. James L. Garlow and Peter Jones. And I believe Peter Jones is from England. I'm not sure Garlow is from, check here. Garlow's from Princeton Theological Seminary. That's pretty decent. And the other guy also has a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, but he's from England. And Peter Jones is quite interesting because he grew up with John Lennon, one of the Beatles. So, he's not terribly biased, I should think, in this regard in terms of being, on the outs with the Masons or something. But the thing is that these people who are pushing this, they're into witchcraft, they're into, all kinds of strange cult-like groups, anti-Semitism, all of this stuff. The Da Vinci Code material, and this is coming from some very suspicious sources. It is, like I say, you trace it back, you find homosexuals, and pedophiles, and all kinds of strange things in the background of these people that, quite frankly, if you want to talk about people who have bias,
oh, yes.
Well, there's tons of bias out there, and
sure.
It's all on the side, I shouldn't say all on the side, but certainly a lot of it is on the side of these guys who are pushing the Da Vinci Code and these movies, which will start coming out this summer, on us. This is a plot, if you will, but it's not a plot from the left. Pay attention here. This is a plot from the right.
Ooh, how interesting.
The old Nazi right, the old aristocratic right, the old put the guy back on the throne right.
Oh,
those guys.
Oh, my.
And would you really understand where Dan Brown's coming from? He comes from an elite family. I mean, he's a guy who went to prep school in New England, and had an Ivy League education, was sent to Spain to study art history. This is the kind of background that he has. And so he comes from this elitist group that is really part of an old tradition, the old secret society, elite, aristocratic creme de la creme of society that believes that they should run everything, that they know better than we do, and that the masses are deceived because, after all, look, they believe in Jesus, they believe in the Bible.
Well, Hillary Clinton is right in there with them.
Yes,
you know,
that's the kind of mindset that we're talking about, except that, of course, she's more of a socialist.
Yeah.
But some of these people were Fabian socialists, which is a particular kind of socialism. And when you look at what Hitler was, he was a national socialist. Okay, that's what the Nazi word means. It means national socialist. And so Nazi or national socialist, these guys are a kind of socialist. But it's very different from the communism, for example, of Russia. In Russia, a group of the proletariat takes up control and by brute force seizes the wealth and power and everything of the rich, and then distributes it to the poor, and then after 3 or 4 years of living off of the refuse of the rich, they then have to enslave the people and force them into slave labor camps to keep the culture going. But in the case of these other socialists, these national socialists, if you will, their belief was that you use the government to support the corporations, to keep them propped up. And by doing that, you really what we call socialism for the rich, socialism for the corporations.
Right.
Corporate socialism, which we see in this country.
Oh, yes, and it's rampant.
And this process is really part of establishing what the communists like to call fascism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but it really is another form of socialism. Anytime the government begins to take over the country, Ayn Rand had a nail. She says they're all statists. You know, they all believe in the government running everything.
Yeah.
And that's obviously ultimately what's going on here.
And they believe in that, Olaf, as long as they are part of it.
Exactly.
See, they if they were out here with the little people, the backbone of the country, they wouldn't be believing in that kind of garbage.
Well, that's why I say we always need to, whenever the Republicans are in power too long, we need a Democrat just to cleanse the palate, you know. It's important to keep switching back and forth because one group is going to lean one way and the other group's going to lean the other way. And you have to keep switching back and forth because if you leave the Republicans in too long, the environment will get destroyed and they'll end up putting lead filings in your cereal.
Yeah.
So you have to periodically clean things up by sticking the other party in. And that's the way. That's the beauty of the American system is we switch back and forth enough so that neither side gets to entrench itself too much. However, the Rockefellers figured out a way around that because they apparently have figured out how to control who gets nominated by both parties.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's, between the Rockefellers and the Skull and Bones and these other guys who try to dominate both parties and control both candidacies. So that, for example, in the recent election in 2004, we had two Skull and Bonesmen running against each other. And in 1992, we had two Rockefeller guys running against each other. Did you tell me that Ross Perot was a Rockefeller guy?
I never said that. I don't
know whether he was or not. But anyway, they were all left-handed, I can tell you that much.
I'm sure.
So, I know you're left-handed too. But it's true that the system we have tends toward these problems. I mean, we have some socialism and we have some fascism, if you will, or national socialism, or whatever you want to call corporate socialism. But in the days of the French in the post-war era in the 1950s that Pierre Plantarn grew up out of, there was something going on that was of great concern to the Allied leaders. I mean, they were thinking, what are we going to do after the war ended? What are we going to do with Hitler's philosophy? Because they wanted to know, first of all, during the Nuremberg trials and then afterwards, should they keep it a secret as to what Hitler and his henchmen were really all about? You know, should we reveal to the public their pagan, homosexual, pedophile origins?
Yeah.
Into all of that theosophical stuff? Or should we bury it? Should we keep that from the people? And Churchill said that it would corrupt the nations to allow this stuff out into public.
Sure.
That their goal was to suppress it. They felt that by allowing all this garbage to be aired after the war would have brought about a lot of corruption because so many people would have bought into this. You know how people are.
Yeah.
Even though 99% of the people reject it, you expose it to 100 million people and you suddenly have 1 million followers of something really sick.
Sure.
And so they said it would be best to just, just talk about the murders, talk about the war crimes, but leave out the part about what the religious psychosexual matrix was out of which all this grew.
Yeah, well, the Nuremberg trials didn't touch that part of it at all.
No, the Nuremberg trials were show trials. They picked one person in each industry, one general, one publisher, one banker, et cetera, and they said that's what they were doing. These were just men who were chosen, for example, of what they thought were the most egregious offenders that they could still get their hands on.
Yeah.
South America somewhere, or for that matter, America, JPL. And so they grabbed these guys and put them on trial and convicted only a few of them. I think, was it only, 7 of them got convicted or something?
No,
7 or 8?
Not many of them were.
No, not the whole group. No. About half of them or more got off. So, I mean, even some of the worst offenders still got off. And so only a handful of people ever really were put on trial. And this, of course, made the Jews very upset, as you can imagine. Should have made the Christians upset, too.
Do you know recently Italy dismissed all charges against a known Nazi that had murdered hundreds of people, and they just dismissed it? Yeah.
I don't know anything about that case. So
I mean, how times change.
But the thing is that the Jews were so upset about this, they decided they were going to draw up a hit list of the guys that the Allies had let go, basically, or that were hiding out in South America.
Right.
People like Adolf Eichmann and people like that. And they started to hunt them down and bring them in and put them on trial. Now, you could have just assassinated them. And some people charged that they did assassinate. I don't know. But they certainly brought a lot of them back to Israel and put them on trial. And tried to at least bring some justice and some law and order to this process. But, you see, there were a lot of other people who slipped through the net here, the vast majority of them. These guys went out, and they started to form little organizations. One was called Odessa, which is the organization of German Deutsche, that's the D there, former SS officers. Mm-hmm. And Odessa was it was a real organization. There was a novel written called The Odessa File by Frederick Forsyth, I believe it was, back in the early 60s, which or mid-60s, I'm sorry, which said that they were trying to set off an atomic bomb in Israel, and that, which apparently was true, and that there were some people, including the Arabs and the Muslims, who were all wrapped up in that process. In other words, that they had allies in the Muslim world. And in fact, this is quite true. You go back to World War II and before, you can see that the Muslims and these guys were allied with one another.
Well, the Nazis today are using the Muslims.
Yeah, and the Masons had an alliance with the Muslims. Mm-hmm. And you can see a lot of people had alliances with the Muslims that you wouldn't have expected. When you come down to it, the Holy Blood, Holy Grail people have, in fact, a potential alliance here with the Muslims, because just as the Nazis were allied with them, you read in Dan Brown's books, he will make comments in some of his books, or has characters making.
No, you're talking about the DaVinci Code, right?
Well, I think actually the quote I'm going to give you is from Angels and Demons, I believe.
Okay.
But there's a comment in there that he makes about his about religious philosophy, and what he says here is that that whether you worship in Mecca or whether you pray to Jesus or whatever, it doesn't really matter. That it's all the same thing. He tries to put this together, in other words, as if somehow or other it doesn't make a difference whether you worship Jesus or you worship Muhammad or whatever, obey Muhammad. And that's very revealing, it seems to me, because it tells you that underneath the surface, if you scratch these guys, you're going to find out that they really have some very strange alliances.
Yeah.
And that obviously is, that's just one little example, but there's a ton of these little hints and clues in his books that indicate that things haven't really changed a whole lot since World War II. That we're still dealing with this same philosophy, however it's repackaged, and they may throw Adolf Hitler over the side because he's a liability now to the philosophy.
Olaf,
this goes back to the 19th century. You got to understand,
right.
Hitler was just a sideshow for them. That this is a philosophy that Dan Brown is right in the middle of the inheritance of. This is not something that he is not connected with. He's preaching this same basic philosophy that started all of this back in the days of Helena Blavatsky in the 19th century.
Well, I've got this little revelation for everybody. In the Bible where it states, it is only by the name of Jesus that we can be saved. Now, it says saved. Okay, go ahead. You can believe in all these other gods and goddesses and what have you. The Joseph Smiths and the this and the that. It doesn't mean you will be saved. Those people, what if those people just come back and they go through the reincarnation process where their souls are scalped when they die, and they just are forced back on this birth-death wheel repetitively. They are not saved.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, I have to work this out, but from what you were saying, it just struck me that there's two categories. And
these people are pushing reincarnation.
Oh, sure they are.
It's one of the lies that they teach.
They want slaves, spiritual slaves.
Yeah, Dan Brown is making excuses for witchcraft. Some of the things he says about witches in here are absolutely appalling. He claims that, I think it's 9 million witches were burned by the church.
Oh, my goodness.
In the Middle Ages. That's a total lie.
Yeah,
it's not true.
I know that's not true.
Completely false. I did a lot of research on how many people were actually executed by the Inquisition for all things, for all subjects, and for all reasons, men and women combined. And in the Encyclopedia Britannica and elsewhere and so forth, I couldn't find more than 30,000 convictions estimated to have occurred. That's convictions. And not all of those people were put to death. And of the people who were put to death, they were all put to death basically by the civil authorities, not by the church. And it wasn't for witchcraft. Some of them maybe for witchcraft, but there were a whole bunch of different things that people were executed for. And even now, the pagans themselves have started to acknowledge this, and pagan scholars and witches are coming forth and saying, well, all that stuff that we've been saying about millions of women being killed by the church and so forth, it really wasn't true. And even though this is written about in a lot of popular books, they say the truth is that that is not what happened. Witches like Jenny Gibbons and there's another pagan named, she's a pagan. There's another one in here, Robin Briggs and so forth, other people who were revealing that the number that was far smaller than what they're talking about. And it wasn't just witches. It was a whole range of different reasons why people were being put to death in the time of the Inquisition. But in the time of the Inquisition, you've got to be careful here, because the Inquisition period was a time when people would call experts in from Rome. 3 Dominican friars would come in to judge a matter that the local civil authorities had arrested somebody for, but they were uncertain about how to determine the matter. And so they needed ecclesiastical help in defining some of these things, and these guys would come in and they would listen to the evidence, and they would try to tell them, well, yeah, this is heresy, or that is witchcraft, or whatever the question was that they were raising.
Sounds like an early version of the Patriot Act.
It was what we call a three-judge panel today.
Yeah.
Grand jury, three-judge panel type thing. I mean, we really derived a lot of things from the Inquisition. But most of the people who came before the Inquisition were acquitted. They needed a unanimous decision before anybody could be put to death. And then, even after being convicted, and it wasn't the Inquisitors who convicted them, I mean, it was the civil authorities who did. The Inquisitors gave their judgment. It had to be a unanimous decision, plus the civil authorities' decision. And then, after all of that, and by the way, if you brought a false accusation of witchcraft against somebody, you'd be given whatever the punishment was in that particular case. But once a person was convicted, they still needed a confession. And it was only after the conviction that people then were tortured to get a confession out of them, because they didn't want to execute a person who hadn't confessed.
Right.
I mean, which is kind of bizarre, but that's the way they did things. But,
well, it isn't bizarre, Olaf, because it has also a dimension of the legal right spiritually, whether it be under God or whether it be under Satan.
Well, yeah, whose authority are you
right.
pay here? But as I was saying, most of the people during the Inquisition got off. But in the United States today, 90% of the people who come before the bar of justice are convicted.
Right.
You had a better chance against the Inquisition. And in Spain, people preferred to go before the Inquisition rather than the civil courts. They actually begged to be transferred to the Inquisition courts.
We need to wrap this up, Olaf, because our time is getting short.
Yeah, we need to understand that these people lived in a different era, and to them, these were reforms, and the Inquisition was an improvement over what they had dealt with previously. And Dan Brown's version of history is so distorted and so corrupt in terms of presenting what actually happened that it's a tragedy, and he should have known better. If he'd done any research at all, he would have seen that these people had confessed that the basis of his novels was a hoax.
Well, it's all part of an agenda. Folks, go to thetimequest.com. Visit Olaf Hage's website. We thank you, Olaf. There will be a part 2 to this particular session. And God bless everybody out there, and take care. This is Georgianne Hughes with The Bite Show, signing off.